The date was February 26th, 2026. At the Stevens Pass Ski Resort in Washington, the air was crisp and the mountain was draped in 10 inches of fresh, untouched powder. For Michael Harris, a father of 4 from Bothell, it was the kind of morning every experienced skier dreams of. He was a man who knew these slopes, a seasonal veteran who felt at home in the high-altitude silence of the Cascades. By noon, he had already spent hours carving through the backside of the mountain, taking the double diamond chairlift up into the clouds and descending through the white velvet of the Pacific Northwest. To any observer, it was a routine Thursday, a simple day of solo exploration before returning to his family. But in the next few minutes, this serene winter landscape would transform into a vertical tomb. Imagine you are in a place where no one can hear you scream, buried under a weight so heavy it feels like the earth itself is trying to crush the breath from your lungs. This was not a nightmare for Michael Harris. It was the visceral reality that began at the edge of an expert run known as Big Chief Bowl. Michael was preparing for what he intended to be his final run of the day. He followed another skier into the bowl, but he made a split-second decision to veer just 10 to 15 feet to the side to find a clean, untouched line. It was a choice made for the love of the sport, a search for that perfect, quiet moment in the powder. But as he committed to his turn, the ground beneath his skis didn't just slide, it disintegrated. A persistent, weak layer, hidden deep beneath the fresh snowfall, suddenly gave way with a sickening, muffled crack. The avalanche triggered both above and below him simultaneously, and in an instant, the world turned into a chaotic white centrifuge. Michael tried to fight, using the swimming motions he had been taught in avalanche safety courses, desperately clawing at the moving snow to stay near the surface. He saw a massive boulder looming in his path and managed to steer his body around it, a small victory in a losing battle. Then, the world went dark. He was plunged into a natural snow hole and buried upright, encased in snow that instantly packed tight, hardening into something Michael later described as feeling exactly like wet cement. He was completely immobilized, buried several feet beneath the surface in a standing position. He could feel his Apple Watch on his wrist and his iPhone in his jacket pocket, but his arms were pinned to his sides as if he were wearing a straitjacket made of ice. In the sudden, terrifying silence that followed the slide, Michael realized the gravity of his situation. Statistically, he was already a dead man. Experts know that the survival rate for avalanche victims drops to nearly 0 after just 2 hours, and the mountain was vast, his location unmarked by any visible sign on the surface. He was a ghost in the machine, a living soul trapped in a frozen void, and as the cold began to seep into his bones, he did the only thing he could. He began to pray. But while Michael lay in the darkness, miles away in Bothell, a digital tether was still active. His wife, Penny Harris, began to feel a gnawing sense of intuition that something was fundamentally wrong. It started as a quiet unease when Michael didn't answer a routine text, but as the minutes turned into hours, that unease sharpened into a cold, piercing dread. She opened the Find My app on her phone, expecting to see his icon moving toward the lodge or heading down the highway. Instead, she saw a static blue dot. It was a ghost location, a coordinate frozen in the middle of Big Chief Bowl that had not moved a single inch in 3 hours. She was watching her husband's location from the safety of her living room, unaware that she was looking at the exact spot where he was fighting for every shallow breath. The silence of the mountain is an unforgiving thing for those who underestimate it. And as Michael felt the weight of the snow pressing against his chest, he knew he was running out of time. He had managed to clear a small, beach ball-sized air pocket in front of his face before the snow set, a tiny reservoir of oxygen that was the only thing standing between him and suffocation. He could hear his phone buzzing in his pocket, the frantic pings of Penny's messages, but he was powerless to answer. Every vibration was a reminder of the life he was leaving behind, and the family that was currently watching a dot on a map, waiting for a movement that wouldn't come. This was the beginning of a 4-hour struggle that would redefine the limits of human endurance and the power of a wife's intuition. Would you have stayed calm in that darkness? Or would the silence of the tomb have broken you before the cold could? The date was February 26th, 2026, and in the frozen silence of Washington's Stevens Pass, a man was being erased from the world. Michael Harris was an experienced skier, a father of 4, and a man who understood the mountains. But as the snow settled over him in the Big Chief Bowl, the world he knew vanished behind a wall of white cement. Most people don't realize how heavy an avalanche truly is. It isn't fluffy powder, but a crushing physical weight that pins your limbs and collapses your lungs. Statistics in the Pacific Northwest are unforgiving. They tell us that if you aren't found within 15 minutes, your chances of survival drop into a vertical nosedive. After 30 minutes, you are likely chasing a ghost. But Michael Harris had been under the snow for 4 hours. 240 minutes of absolute darkness, where the only sound was the thumping of his own heart and the muffled, distant vibration of a phone he couldn't reach. This isn't just a story of a mountain's fury or a freak accident in the backcountry. It is the story of a wife's intuition, a digital ghost on a screen, and a man who held his breath against the impossible. How does a human body continue to function when its internal temperature plummets to 70 degrees Fahrenheit? Why did Penny Harris decide to check the Find My app at the exact moment her husband's air was running out? Michael was buried upright, encased in a tomb of ice, praying for a miracle while his family miles away watched a blue GPS dot that refused to move. It was a race against a clock that everyone else believed had already run out. Michael was still breathing, but for the rest of the world, he was already gone. 30 miles away in the quiet suburb of Bothell, the mundane rhythm of a Thursday afternoon was beginning to fracture. Penny Harris was not a woman prone to panic, but she was a woman who knew the specific cadence of her husband's life. Michael was a man of routine, a seasoned skier who understood the importance of the check-in, especially when venturing into the deep powder of Stevens Pass alone. By mid-afternoon, the silence from his end had shifted from a simple delay to a physical weight in the pit of her stomach. She had sent multiple texts, simple queries about his day and his expected return, but the familiar chime of a reply never came. It was a specific, chilling intuition that guided her fingers to the Find My app at that exact moment. When the map loaded, she didn't see a moving icon heading toward the parking lot or a signal jumping along the highway. Instead, she saw a blue dot anchored deep within the expert terrain of Big Chief Bowl. It wasn't just that he was still on the mountain, it was the absolute mathematical stillness of the location. In the world of GPS, there is usually a drift, a slight jitter as satellites talk to a moving device. But Michael's phone was reporting a ghost location, a coordinate so fixed and so unchanging that it suggested the device was no longer in a pocket, but perhaps abandoned in the snow. Or worse, it was pinned beneath it. What Penny couldn't know was that Michael was currently listening to those very notifications. Beneath several feet of packed, suffocating snow, the vibration of his iPhone against his thigh was the only thing tethering him to the land of the living. Each buzz was a reminder that he was being looked for, yet each silence that followed felt like a door closing on his life. His air pocket, roughly the size of a beach ball, was slowly filling with the carbon dioxide of his own breath. He was experiencing the visceral reality of snow cement, where the heat from his body had slightly melted the surrounding crystals, only for them to refreeze into an airtight shell. He was breathing in his own waste, his lungs burning as the oxygen levels plummeted. Why did Penny check the app at that exact second? To many, it was a coincidence, but for Michael, it was the first thread of a miracle. While his body temperature was beginning its slow slide into the 70s, causing his heart rate to stutter, the digital tether was finally being pulled from the other side. Penny wasn't just looking at a map, she was staring at the exact spot where her husband was being buried alive. The silence of the mountain was absolute, but the digital scream of that static blue dot was finally loud enough to be heard. Would you have trusted your gut in that moment? Or would you have waited another hour for a call that was never going to come? For Penny, the choice was instant. She didn't wait for the sun to go down. She picked up the phone and changed the course of Michael's fate. The date was February 26th, 2026, and at Stevens Pass Ski Resort, the morning air was crisp, filled with the promise of untouched powder. Michael Harris was a man who knew these slopes, a father of 4 who found his peace in the rhythmic carve of a ski through fresh snow. He had spent the early hours riding the double diamond chairlift, seeking out the steep, technical terrain of the backside where the crowds rarely ventured. To anyone watching from the lift, it was a standard Thursday, just another experienced skier enjoying the rewards of a heavy winter storm. But the mountain was hiding a secret beneath its beautiful white surface. A persistent weak layer of snow sat buried under 10 inches of fresh, heavy accumulation, waiting for the slightest pressure to shatter its fragile stability. Around noon, Michael decided on one last run before heading home to his family in Bothell. He dropped into Big Chief Bowl, an expert inbounds area that demanded respect even on the best days. He followed another skier's tracks for a moment before deciding to move just 10 or 15 feet to the side to find a clean, white line. It was a simple choice, the kind of decision skiers make 1,000 times a season. But as he initiated his turn, the world beneath his feet simply vanished. The snowpack didn't just slide, it disintegrated, triggering a slab avalanche both above and below his position. Suddenly, Michael wasn't skiing anymore. He was a passenger in a white torrent of kinetic energy. He remembered his training and began making desperate swimming motions, fighting with every ounce of his strength to stay near the churning surface. The noise was a deafening roar of grinding ice and snapping branches, a visceral reality that replaced the serene silence of the bowl in a heartbeat. In a final, frantic maneuver, he managed to steer his body around a massive boulder, a split-second action that likely saved him from immediate blunt force trauma. Then, the world went black. He was plunged into a natural snow hole and buried upright, the moving mountain coming to a sudden, violent halt. The snow instantly set around him like quick-dry cement, pinning his arms to his sides and crushing the air from his lungs. He was encased in a tomb of ice, completely immobilized under several feet of suffocating weight. Most people in this position panic, their heart rates spiking as they realize they cannot move a single finger. But Michael managed to stay calm enough to clear a small, beach ball-sized air pocket directly in front of his face. It was a tiny sanctuary of oxygen in a world of frozen pressure, but he knew the statistics as well as any veteran of the Cascades. In an avalanche burial, the window of life closes rapidly after the first 15 minutes, and after 2 hours, the chance of being found alive is almost zero. He lay there in the crushing dark, feeling the cold begin its slow crawl into his bones, and he began to pray. He spoke to God in the silence of his frozen grave, asking for a miracle even as he heard his phone buzzing in his pocket. It was his wife, Penny, calling from the world above, but he couldn't even twitch his hand to reach it. He was a ghost on the mountain, a static coordinate on a digital map, waiting to see if anyone would notice he had stopped moving. Would you have kept your head in that darkness? Or would the silence of the tomb have broken your will before the cold could finish the job? As the minutes turned into hours, the physical toll of the burial began to manifest in a terrifying sequence of biological failures. The weight of the snow was so immense that it began to interfere with his circulation, a sensation Michael would later describe as his body being slowly squeezed by a giant. Every breath was a calculated effort, a trade-off between the precious oxygen in his small air pocket and the carbon dioxide slowly poisoning his limited atmosphere. The silence of the mountain was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to amplify the frantic pounding of his own heart. He was a mile from the lodge and thousands of feet up a mountain, but he might as well have been on the moon. Back in Bothell, the mundane routine of the afternoon was about to be shattered by a wife's intuition. Penny Harris noticed the silence from her husband was different this time. It wasn't the silence of a man busy skiing, it was the silence of a void. When she opened the tracking app and saw that lone blue dot sitting motionless in the middle of Big Chief Bowl, she knew the ghost location wasn't a glitch. It was a distress signal from a man who could no longer speak for himself. She didn't hesitate, and that single decision to trust her gut over the comfort of logic was the first link in a chain of events that would defy every known survival statistic in the history of Stevens Pass. The date was February 26th, 2026. For Michael Harris, a resident of Bothell and a father of 4, the morning was supposed to be a brief escape from the heavy weight of being a sole provider. He was currently between jobs, a position that creates a specific kind of quiet pressure in a man's chest, the kind that only the cold, biting air of the Cascades can seem to soothe. Michael was no amateur. He was an experienced skier who lived for the double diamond runs, those steep, unforgiving pitches where the world shrinks down to the tips of your skis and the rhythm of your own breath. The mountain was in rare form that morning, draped in 10 inches of fresh, light powder that hummed under the chairlift. As he sat on the lift, the rhythmic, mechanical clicking of the cable was the only sound in the frozen air. Everything felt routine, comfortable, and entirely safe. By noon, Michael decided it was time for one last run, the final descent before heading back to the warmth of his family. He pushed off into the expert terrain of Big Chief Bowl, following the tracks of another skier who had already carved a safe line through the center. But then, Michael made a decision that many of us would have made in his position. Seeking the thrill of an untouched line, he veered just 10 to 15 feet to the side of the existing tracks. He didn't know that beneath those 10 inches of beautiful fresh snow sat a persistent, weak layer. A structural flaw in the mountain's armor that was waiting for the weight of a single human being to fail. As he moved, he heard it. A sharp, sickening hiss of sliding crystals that lasted only a heartbeat before the world beneath him simply vanished. The snow triggered simultaneously above and below him, turning the solid mountainside into a churning white river of concrete. He felt the sudden heavy thud of the slope collapsing, a transition from the exhilaration of flight to the absolute darkness of a grave. In his jacket pocket, his iPhone buzzed with a notification he could no longer reach, a piece of technology that was supposed to be his lifeline. But in this suffocating silence, it was about to become an instrument of mental torture. Michael Harris thought he was chasing the perfect run. Instead, he was chasing his own grave. The mountain did not just fall. It inhaled him. One moment, Michael was carving through a pristine white canvas, and the next, the world was a liquid, churning beast that stripped away his gravity. He felt the sickening lurch of the snow beneath his skis, a persistent, weak layer that had finally reached its breaking point. This was not the light, fluffy powder he had been chasing all morning. This was 10 inches of fresh accumulation acting as a lubricant for the massive slab above. And as it shattered, Michael was thrust into a violent, high-speed tumble. He tried to remember the core tenets of Avalanche training, those frantic, swimming motions designed to keep a human body near the surface of the moving debris. He fought with every ounce of his strength, his arms flailing against a current that felt like wet concrete. The force was astronomical, a visceral reality of physics where the mountain was the hammer and he was the nail. For a heartbeat, a massive boulder loomed in his path, a gray monolith capable of ending the story instantly, but a desperate split-second maneuver allowed him to steer around it. Then, the world went dark. The motion stopped with a bone-jarring suddenness that felt like hitting a brick wall. Michael was no longer swimming. He was entombed. He was buried in a near-vertical position, his legs twisted and his body upright, trapped in a natural snow hole that had filled in around him. The pressure was immediate and absolute, a crushing grip that made even the act of expanding his lungs a Herculean task. He could feel the cold radiating through his gear, but the most terrifying sensation was the immobility. He was encased in cement, a prisoner of the Big Chief Bowl, and as the silence of the tomb settled over the slope, he realized the only thing he could move was his eyes. He had managed to clear a small, beach ball-sized air pocket in front of his face, a tiny bubble of oxygen in a world of white. But would it be enough to last until the search began? Michael knew the statistics, and the statistics said he was already a dead man. The moment the mountain stopped moving, the world transformed into a solid, cold, and suffocating weight. Michael's body was held in a vertical vice, pinned upright, as if he had been dropped into a container of wet concrete that had hardened in a single heartbeat. In those final, chaotic seconds of the slide, his survival instincts had taken over, forcing his arms into a desperate swimming motion to fight the downward pull of the debris. He had felt the massive, dark shadow of a boulder rushing toward him, and with a split-second jerk of his frame, managed to navigate around the stone that would have crushed his skull. But as he plunged into a natural snow hole, the white wave crested over him, and the oxygen was replaced by a crushing silence. He was now encased in cement, a phrase Michael would later use to describe the absolute lack of give in the snowpack. Every inch of his suit was pressed against the frozen wall, and the weight of the mountain was so immense that his chest could barely expand to take a breath. However, he had managed one final life-saving maneuver before the movement ceased completely. He had cleared a small, beach ball-sized air pocket directly in front of his face. This tiny, hollow sphere was his only lifeline, a biological micro-loop that provided just enough oxygen to keep his brain from shutting down. Without it, the carbon dioxide from his own breath would have pooled around his mouth, putting him to sleep forever in less than 10 minutes. In the absolute darkness of his tomb, the only sound was the rhythmic, jagged rasp of his own breathing echoing off the smooth, white walls of the pocket. The air was thick and moist. As he exhaled, he could feel the warmth of his breath hit the snow, only to watch it condense and turn into a thin, glinting layer of ice that slowly sealed the pores of the snow. He was effectively building his own coffin out of ice. His arms were pinned to his sides, paralyzed by the sheer atmospheric pressure of the snow above him. He could feel the Apple Watch on his wrist and the iPhone tucked into his jacket pocket, but they might as well have been on the moon. He was a modern man, surrounded by the most advanced communication technology on the planet, yet he was utterly unreachable. Suddenly, a familiar vibration rippled against his thigh. His phone was buzzing. It was a text, perhaps from Penny, or a notification from his children. He could feel the ghost of his family reaching out through the digital void, their love converted into a mechanical hum that mocked his paralysis. He was buried in an inbounds area, a place where safety was supposed to be guaranteed. Above him, he heard the faint, rhythmic shh of skis cutting through the powder. People were sliding right over his head, laughing and enjoying the crisp mountain air, completely unaware that a father of 4 was dying just inches beneath their skis. What would you have done in that moment, knowing that help was only a few feet away, yet you were invisible to the world? Michael closed his eyes and began to pray, realizing that his only hope lay in a miracle that defied every known statistic of the mountain. While Michael lay in the suffocating darkness of Big Chief Bowl, 70 miles away in the quiet suburb of Bothell, the air in the Harris household began to grow heavy with an unspoken dread. Penny Harris was used to the rhythm of her husband's solo ski trips, a routine of check-in texts and afternoon updates that maintained a comfortable digital tether between the mountains and home. But as the clock pushed past noon, the silence from Michael's end of the line transitioned from a minor annoyance to a visceral weight. She sent a message, then another, watching the delivered status sit in a vacuum of unresponsiveness. It is a specific type of torture known only to those who love an adventurer. The slow-motion realization that the silence isn't a lack of signal, but a lack of life. By 1 p.m., Penny's deep sense of intuition had bypassed concern and moved straight into a cold, clinical panic. She opened the Find My app on her iPhone, a tool designed for finding lost keys or misplaced tablets, but today it was the only window she had into her husband's world. The screen flickered to life, showing the familiar topographical map of Stevens Pass, and there it was, the blue icon representing Michael. It was sitting in the middle of a steep, white expanse. At first, she told herself he was just taking a long lunch or perhaps enjoying the view from a ridge. But as the minutes ticked into hours, the horror of the image began to sink in. In a survival story, movement is life. A moving dot means a heart is beating, legs are pumping, and a person is navigating their way back to safety. But this was a static dot. It was a ghost on the map. Imagine you are Penny. You are looking at a glowing screen in the comfort of your kitchen, seeing your husband's heart, represented by a tiny blue pulse, perfectly still in a bowl of white death. The icon didn't drift toward the lodge. It didn't move toward the lifts. It sat frozen, an anomaly in a place where everything is supposed to flow. For 3 agonizing hours, Penny maintained a silent vigil over that static coordinate. She tried to convince herself it was just a glitch in the software or a phone dropped in the snow during a fall. But her gut, that raw maternal instinct, told her she was looking at a tragedy in real time. The digital tether was still holding, but it felt like it was pulling on a dead weight. She watched the clock hit 3 p.m., then 3:30 p.m., and the dot remained anchored to that single deadly point on the mountain. The shift from a worried wife to a woman of calculated action happened in an instant. She knew the mountain was closing soon, and if Michael was still out there, the plummeting temperatures would finish what the snow had started. She picked up the phone to call the Stevens Pass Ski Patrol, but a terrifying thought stopped her mid-dial. Would they actually listen to a report based on a phone app? Or would they dismiss it as a lost device or a clown show of a panicked spouse? In the world of professional search and rescue, a Find My ping is often seen as a wild goose chase. Penny had to decide if she would trust the technology or let the silence claim her husband forever. Would you have the courage to demand a rescue based on nothing but a static dot on a map? She placed the call, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, providing the exact GPS coordinates to a skeptical dispatcher. As she hung up and began the drive toward the resort, Penny wasn't just chasing a signal, she was chasing a ghost. She was mentally preparing herself to retrieve a body, unaware that Michael was still breathing in his cement-like tomb, his life now hanging entirely on whether the patrol teams would trust the digital breadcrumbs she had provided. The ghost location was no longer just a dot. It was a race against a 4-hour clock that had almost run out of time. The 2-hour limit is not a suggestion in the world of Avalanche survival. It is a hard, biological wall. Michael Harris knew this statistic better than most, and as the darkness of the Big Chief Bowl pressed against his eyes, he realized the clock had already run out. The human body is a furnace, but once it is encased in the cement of packed snow, that furnace begins to fail. He could feel the blood retreating from his fingers and toes, a desperate migration toward his core to protect his heart and brain. It felt as if his extremities were simply dissolving into the ice, leaving him as nothing more than a flickering consciousness trapped in a frozen chest. In the absolute silence of his burial, the only sound was the frantic, muffled vibration from his jacket pocket. It was Penny. It was Lauren. Every buzz was a physical jolt of love, a reminder that the world above still wanted him back. But each vibration was also a cruel hope crush. He knew they were searching, but he also knew that with every passing minute, the oxygen in his beach ball-sized air pocket was being replaced by the toxic warmth of his own carbon dioxide. The air was becoming heavy and sweet, a lethal sedative that whispered to him to just close his eyes and drift away. Michael stopped fighting the snow and started fighting the sleep. He began a mental conversation with God, not asking for a rescue, but explaining why he couldn't leave yet. He pictured his 4 children, their faces vivid against the blackness of the snow. He wasn't fighting for his own life anymore. He was trying to simply exist as a lighthouse for the people on the other side of that vibrating phone. A single tear escaped and began to track down his face, but before it could reach his chin, the cold claimed it, freezing the salt water directly to his skin. He was no longer a man skiing. He was a father trying to stay awake in a tomb of ice, waiting for the digital breadcrumbs to lead his family home. Would you have the mental strength to stay awake when your own breath is poisoning you? The silence in Big Chief Bowl was suddenly shattered by the rhythmic thrumming of a specialized engine. High above the burial site, the first members of the Stevens Pass Ski Patrol arrived at the ridgeline, their goggles reflecting a landscape that looked as peaceful as a postcard and as deadly as a minefield. They weren't looking for a person anymore. They were looking for a ghost. The GPS coordinates provided by Penny Harris had led them to a specific coordinate in the vast, white bowl. But to the naked eye, there was nothing but a jagged scar where the slab had broken away. The lead patroller checked his device, the digital blue dot pulsing directly beneath his boots. He knew the statistics as well as he knew the mountain, and after 4 hours he was likely standing over a grave. But then, a search dog named Zora began to pace frantically, her nose dipping into a small, inconspicuous depression in the snow. She let out a sharp, urgent bark that cut through the mountain air like a siren. The rescuers didn't hesitate. They deployed collapsible probes, driving the long metal poles deep into the compacted debris. On the third strike, one of the patrollers felt a distinct, soft bottom, the unmistakable resistance of a human body. "Strike! I have a strike!" he shouted, and the mechanical precision of the team shifted into a desperate, high-speed scramble. They began to dig, but the snow wasn't fluffy powder anymore. The friction of the avalanche had flash-heated the crystals before they froze solid again, turning the debris into a substance that felt more like reinforced concrete than frozen water. Every shovel pass was a battle against a mountain that didn't want to give up its prey. They threw blocks of ice over their shoulders, their own lungs burning in the thin, cold air, until a flash of bright Gore-Tex appeared at the bottom of the hole. Michael Harris heard the metallic scrape of a shovel blade against his helmet. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, a physical confirmation that his prayers had bridged the gap between the living world and his icy tomb. As the weight was lifted from his chest, the sudden rush of oxygen felt like fire in his throat. His eyes flickered open to see a circle of red jackets against a blindingly blue sky. "Michael! Michael, can you hear us?" He tried to speak, but his jaw was locked tight by the onset of severe hypothermia. His body, which had been held together by the crushing pressure of the snow, suddenly began to rebel as that pressure was removed. The rescuers saw his skin was a haunting shade of grayish blue, his core temperature having plummeted into the 70s, a range where the heart usually forgets how to beat. They worked with surgical speed to stabilize his neck and slide a backboard beneath him. His right leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the tibial plateau shattered by the force of the burial, but Michael felt no pain. He felt only a strange, drifting lightness as his brain began to shut down from the sheer trauma of the extraction. As they strapped him into the sled and began the treacherous descent down the backside of the mountain, Michael's world narrowed down to the sound of the wind and the fading memory of his wife's face. He had been found, but the battle for his life was moving from the mountain to the trauma ward, and the clock was still ticking. Would you have the presence of mind to stay calm while rescuers dug inches from your face, knowing one wrong shovel strike could collapse your own